The dust came in the spring of 1977, and it came without much warning. That was how it worked in Cimarron County, Oklahoma. The sky would go brown at the horizon around 3 in the afternoon. By 4, it was on you. By 4:15, you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Eldon Pruitt was 61 years old, had been farming the same 320 acres 3 miles east of Boise City since 1941. 36 years on the same red clay soil. He knew dust, had survived the tail end of the old storms as a boy, had watched his father park the tractor and cover the engine with wet burlap and wait it out in the root cellar. He knew what dust could do to a field of young winter wheat just pushing through in April. What he also knew, as of that April afternoon in 1977, was that the windbreak he'd planted 4 years earlier was standing between his crop and the worst of what was coming. 40 acres of eastern red cedars along the west and north fence lines. Still young, already working. Most of Cimarron County thought he'd lost his mind when he planted it. The windbreak ran 2,600 feet along the western boundary and 1,400 feet along the north. Eastern red cedars mostly. Some sand plum and skunk bush along the outer row. Eldon had planted it in the fall of 1973, starting in October and finishing the last post on the 14th of November. 2 days before the first hard freeze. The trees were 4 to 5 feet tall at planting, bare root stock from the Soil Conservation Service office in Guymon. Cost him $214 total for the seedlings, plus the labor of digging 847 individual holes with a 2-man auger borrowed from the county extension office. His neighbor to the west, Clarence Voth, had watched the whole operation from across the fence line. Didn't say much for the first week. Said plenty in the second. Told Eldon he was losing 40 acres of productive ground to a tree farm that wouldn't do anything but collect tumbleweeds and give cover to jackrabbits. Eldon didn't argue the point. Just kept digging holes. The Cimarron County Agricultural Bulletin had run an article in August of 1972 about windbreak planting as an erosion mitigation strategy. The county extension agent, a man named Darrell Fitch, had been recommending shelter belts to every farmer in the region for 2 years. The uptake had been minimal. Fitch had managed to convince exactly 4 farmers in the county to plant windbreaks between 1971 and 1975. Eldon Pruitt was one of them. Clarence Voth was not. The reasoning against windbreaks was straightforward. Arable ground in Cimarron County was not cheap. Losing 40 acres to trees meant losing the yield on 40 acres. At 1973 commodity prices, winter wheat was running around $2.45 a bushel. An average yield on Eldon's ground was roughly 28 bushels per acre. 40 acres times 28 bushels times $2.45 worked out to $2,744 annually in foregone income, not counting input costs. That was real money. Clarence Voth ran those numbers for anyone who'd listen. What Clarence Voth didn't run numbers on was what a 2-day dust event in April cost a winter wheat crop at heading time. Eldon had watched it happen twice in the previous decade. The first time, in 1965, he'd lost 60% of his wheat acreage to wind erosion and abrasion damage. The soil had moved 3 inches deep in some places, cutting the plants off at the crown. He'd filed an emergency loan application with the Farmers Home Administration in Boise City. The paperwork took 11 weeks. The loan came through at 6.5% interest for a 7-year note. The second event, in 1971, had taken 40% of the crop. He'd managed without the loan that year, but just barely. After the 1971 storm, he'd started doing his own reading. Eldon had an 8th grade education, had left school in 1930 to help his father keep the farm going through the Depression. But he read, kept a stack of USDA bulletins on the kitchen table, read the extension publications cover to cover, had a subscription to the Progressive Farmer since 1958. The research on windbreaks wasn't complicated. A shelter belt of sufficient height and density reduced wind speed on the leeward side by 30 to 50% at a distance equal to 10 times the tree height. At a height of 20 feet, which was where Eldon's cedars would be in 10 to 12 years, that meant 200 feet of meaningful wind protection. At tree maturity of 35 to 40 feet, the protection zone extended to 400 feet and beyond. The math was patient math. It required thinking ahead farther than most farmers were asked to think. Darrell Fitch from the Extension Office had stopped by twice during the planting in October 1973. Measured tree spacing, made notes on a clipboard. Said Eldon was one of only 3 or 4 men in the county doing it right. The proper spacing for the species mix Eldon had chosen was 10 feet within row and 12 feet between rows. The outer row of skunk bush acted as a filter. The middle rows of cedar were the primary wind barrier. The inner row of sand plum provided supplemental wildlife benefit and additional density. The outer row was what most people didn't bother with. They planted a single row of trees and called it a windbreak. Fitch told Eldon that a single row windbreak had maybe 15 to 20% of the effectiveness of a properly layered shelter belt. Most farmers who planted them were planting a decoration, not a structure. Eldon had planted 5 rows. By the spring of 1975, the first growing season after establishment, the trees were showing good survival. 91% of the cedars had taken. 6 of the sand plum had died over the winter. 4 skunk bush on the north row had washed out in a March rain event. Eldon replanted 22 trees that April, bought them with his own money that time. 30-50 for the replacements from a nursery in Liberal, Kansas. He drove the 68 miles each way in his 71 Dodge pickup with the seedlings wrapped in wet burlap in the truck bed. The neighbors had stopped asking about the windbreak by 1975. Mostly stopped. Some had shifted from active skepticism to a kind of quiet indifference. The trees were there. They were growing. They weren't producing anything you could price at a grain elevator. That was all most men needed to know. Clarence Voth had one more conversation about it with Eldon at the Boise City Grain Cooperative in February 1976. Said he'd read somewhere that windbreaks cause snow to drift on the leeward side and could actually reduce soil moisture in a drought year through tree root competition. Eldon listened, said he'd read the same article, said the drift accumulation actually improved soil moisture in late spring when it melted slow. Said the root competition zone extended maybe 20 to 30 feet from the tree line and could be mitigated by maintaining a grass buffer strip. Said he had a 15-foot buffer strip of native grass along the inner edge of the shelter belt. Said he'd planned for it. Clarence didn't have a response to that. Bought his seed wheat and left. The spring of 1977 had been dry. January through March had delivered 1.3 inches of total precipitation. The county average for that period was 2.8 inches. The winter wheat had germinated and established the previous fall, but was stressed going into spring. Eldon's field showed 84% canopy cover on April 3rd when he walked it. Clarence Voth's adjoining field, 320 acres to the west, showed similar coverage on the sections Eldon could see from his fence line. The dust event began on the afternoon of April 11th, a Monday. The horizon showed brown from the southwest at 2:45 p.m. By 3:30, the wind had reached 42 miles per hour at the Boise City weather station. By 4 p.m., it was a full storm, sustained at 48 miles per hour with gusts recorded to 61 mph. Visibility at the Boise City airport dropped to 1/4 mile by 4:15. The storm ran through the night and into Tuesday morning. It didn't fully clear until 11 a.m. on April 12th, roughly 20 hours total. Eldon sat it out in the house. He'd moved the tractor into the machine shed at 2:30 when he saw the horizon change. Had wet down the engine compartment with a water can and shut the shed doors. Covered the irrigation pipe connections with canvas tarps he kept staged for that purpose. Had done this before. Knew the sequence. His wife, Ruth, made coffee, and they listened to the radio. The AM station out of Liberal carried weather updates every half hour through the night. The storm was broad, 180 miles wide at its leading edge. 6 counties getting it simultaneously. They didn't talk much. Had been through enough of these to understand the talking happened after, not during. Wednesday morning, April 13th. Eldon walked his fields. The western 120 acres of his crop, the section directly behind the windbreak, had come through in measurable shape. The soil surface was disturbed in places, some leaf tip burning from abrasion. 2 low spots at the south end of the field showed minor deposition, maybe a half-inch of fine material blown in from elsewhere. But the plants were standing. The canopy was intact. The crowns were in the ground where they'd been planted. The eastern 80 acres, the section without windbreak protection, had taken more damage. Visible soil movement in 3 areas. One zone of roughly 2 acres in the northeast corner had lost measurable topsoil, maybe 3/4 of an inch of surface material gone. The wheat there had been partially buried on one side and exposed on the other. The classic sign of soil scouring and deposition in the same field on the same night. Eldon walked the fence line between his ground and Clarence Voth's. Clarence's 320 acres to the west had been hit straight through, fully exposed. No windbreak, no shelter belt, nothing between the western horizon and his crop but 18 inches of barbed wire. The soil had moved. In some sections, it had moved badly. Eldon could see windrows of deposited material along the fence lines, could see bare spots where the wheat had been scoured to bare ground. The canopy cover on Clarence's ground, which had been similar to Eldon's a week earlier, was ragged. Significant sections were beaten flat. Some had been buried under drifted soil. Eldon didn't walk across the fence line. Wasn't his ground to inspect. But he could see well enough from his own side. Darrell Fitch from the Extension Office came out on the 15th, 4 days after the storm. He was doing county-wide assessments for the USDA Emergency Assistance Program. He measured soil loss at multiple points in Eldon's field and in the surrounding fields with unprotected ground. He used a soil erosion assessment protocol that involved the probing for an undisturbed reference layer and measuring the surface deficit. He spent about 2 hours on Eldon's property and another hour on the surrounding section. His notes, which he shared with Eldon at the kitchen table that afternoon, showed 0.4 inches of average soil loss on Eldon's western 120 acres. The surrounding unprotected fields averaged 2.1 inches. On Clarence Voth's ground specifically, the measured average was 2.7 inches in the most exposed sections. That gap, 0.4 inches versus 2.1 to 2.7 inches, was the difference between a damaged crop and a ruined one. Fitch told Eldon his windbreak had performed within the expected parameters. Said the tree height of roughly 9 feet at that point, 4 years of growth, was producing a meaningful protection zone of approximately 80 to 90 feet on the leeward side. Said that as the trees matured, the zone would expand considerably. Said the 5-row design with the outer shrub species was performing exactly as the research predicted. Eldon poured more coffee. Asked Fitch how the other 3 farmers who'd planted windbreaks in the county had fared. Fitch said 2 of them had comparable results. The third had planted a single-row shelter belt that had provided minimal protection and had partially blown out in the storm. Said that farmer was looking at replanting. Eldon said single-row windbreaks weren't really windbreaks. Fitch said that was accurate. The final yield numbers came in that July. Eldon's western 120 acres, the protected section, yielded 24 bushels per acre, down from the county trend year average of 28 bushels, reflecting the stress conditions and the dry spring. But a sellable crop. At the July delivery price of $2.63 per bushel, those 120 acres produced 7,570. His eastern 80 acres, the unprotected section, yielded 19 bushels per acre, still a crop. But the differential was visible in the numbers. Clarence Voth's operation filed for emergency operating credit with the Farmers' Home Administration in June. Eldon heard about it at the feed store in late July. Didn't hear it from Clarence directly. Heard it from Dale Purvis, who sold Clarence his seed wheat and had been waiting on payment. Clarence's western 160 acres, the most exposed portion, had yielded 11 bushels per acre, below the break-even threshold at any delivery price that summer. The eastern 160 had done better, closer to 20 bushels, but the operation as a whole was in deficit. The emergency loan came through for Clarence in August, a 5-year note at 7.25%. Eldon knew the terms from when he'd been through it himself in 1965. It was a workable rate. It would carry him, but it would cost him. By September of 1977, 4 additional Cimarron County farmers had contacted Darrell Fitch about windbreak planting. Fitch told Eldon about it when he stopped to drop off the official storm assessment report in early October. Said the interest had tripled since the April event. Said farmers who'd been dismissing the idea for years were suddenly asking questions. Eldon wasn't surprised. That was how most practical knowledge moved through an agricultural county, not through extension bulletins or USDA recommendations, through what a man could see from his own fence line. Clarence Voth's ground to the west was visible from Eldon's driveway. Any farmer who drove past Eldon's place on the county road could see where one crop ended and another began. Fitch asked Eldon if he'd be willing to talk to some of the interested farmers. Host a field day, maybe, in the spring when the trees were leafed out and the visual was strongest. Let people walk the shelter belt and ask questions. Eldon said he'd think about it. In the spring of 1978, Eldon hosted 9 farmers from 3 counties on a Saturday morning in May. He walked them along the windbreak from the south end to the north. Showed them the 5-row layout. Showed them the grass buffer strip he'd maintained along the inner edge. Showed them the replanting work from 1975, where he'd replaced the 22 trees that hadn't taken. Explained the spacing. Explained the species selection. He answered questions for about 2 hours. Didn't have written materials. Didn't have a presentation prepared. Just walked the fence line and answered what people asked. One of the farmers, a man named Roy Hadley from Texas County, asked what the windbreak had cost him in foregone production over the 4 years since planting. Eldon had thought about this, had done the calculation. The 40 acres taken out of production at an average of 26 bushels per acre, at an average price of $2.55 per bushel over 4 years, worked out to approximately $10,600 in foregone income. The seedling cost had been $200. The labor for installation had been his own, plus 2 days of his son's help during the planting. Roy Hadley asked if it had been worth it. Eldon pointed west toward Clarence Voth's ground, which was visible from where they stood, still showing the uneven recovery growth from the previous year's storm damage. Didn't say anything. Let Roy Hadley look. Roy Hadley planted 2,800 feet of shelter belt that fall. Clarence Voth called Eldon in November of 1978. Said he'd been thinking about the windbreak. Said he wanted to know where Eldon had gotten the tree stock and what the spacing was. Said he'd been talking to Darrell Fitch. Eldon told him everything he'd done and how he'd done it. Told him about the Soil Conservation Service stock program and the species selection and the 5-row design. Told him about the buffer strip. Clarence planted his first shelter belt section in the spring of 1979. amassed 800 feet along his western fence line. Eastern red cedars, same stock, same spacing. He called it a start. Eldon helped him dig the first 200 holes. They used the county extension auger. Worked from 7 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in April. Didn't talk much, just worked. The Cimarron County Windbreak planting program expanded significantly through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Fitch's office tracked it. In 1973, the year Eldon planted, there were 4 actively maintained shelter belts in the county. By 1982, there were 31. By 1988, there were 64. The cumulative linear footage of shelter belt planted in that 15-year period exceeded 180,000 feet, more than 34 miles of trees where there had been open ground. Eldon's Windbreak was the oldest of them. The trees had reached an average height of 22 feet by 1985. The protection zone extended 220 feet on the leeward side at that height, according to the calculation Eldon had been using since he read it in the USDA Bulletin in 1972. His western 120 acres had not sustained significant storm damage in the 8 years since 1977. There had been 2 lesser wind events in 1981 and 1984. Both had moved soil on unprotected fields in the area. Neither had produced measurable erosion in the protected zone behind his shelter belt. He hadn't filed an emergency loan application since 1965. The Windbreak had also produced things Eldon hadn't fully anticipated. The grass buffer strip along the inner edge had developed into a productive wildlife habitat. Quail had established a resident population. His grandchildren, who visited in the summers, knew where to find them. The snow accumulation in winter was significant, as Clarence Voth had predicted. But Eldon's management of the buffer strip allowed it to melt slowly through March and April. Measurable moisture added to the top 18 inches of profile. In a region where every inch of soil moisture mattered, that wasn't nothing. In drought years, 1980 and 1983 were both severe. The moisture contribution from snowmelt retention on the western 120 acres was visible in the yield differential compared to his unprotected eastern 80 acres. The protected ground consistently outperformed by 3 to 5 bushels per acre in low moisture years. In normal years, the difference narrowed. But normal years in Cimarron County were not what you built a farm plan around. Darrell Fitch retired from the Extension Office in 1989. His last county report before retirement cited the Windbreak expansion program as one of the most significant land management achievements in the county's modern agricultural history. He specifically noted that the private adoption of shelter belt technology had been driven primarily by farmer-to-farmer knowledge transfer rather than formal extension programming. Said that 1 or 2 early adopters who were willing to show what worked had done more for Windbreak adoption than 10 years of published bulletins. He mentioned Eldon Pruitt by name. Eldon read the report. Didn't mention it to anyone. By 1993, Eldon's cedars had reached 34 feet in the tallest sections. The canopy was dense and continuous. The protection zone at that height extended 340 feet into the field on the leeward side. The trees had been in the ground for 20 years. They had cost $214 to plant and 38 hours of labor over 2 October weeks in 1973. They had protected roughly 2,400 acres of growing seasons across his western field in the 2 decades since. Eldon Pruitt farmed his 320 acres in Cimarron County until 2001. He was 85 years old. He sold the property to his younger daughter and her husband, a couple named John and Kevin Brandt. They had been farming smaller ground in the Texas Panhandle and were ready to expand. The Windbreak came with the property, as did the maintenance records Eldon had kept in a composition notebook since 1973. Tree survival rates, replanting dates, species notes, pest observations, snow accumulation estimates by winter. He'd filled 3 notebooks over 28 years. Jan Brandt read all 3 before they closed on the property. The Brandts maintained the shelter belt exactly as Eldon had maintained it. Annual inspection in October. Replanting of any dead trees before freeze-up. Mowing of the buffer strip twice a year to prevent woody encroachment. The same sequence Eldon had written in the first notebook, first page. There was a significant wind event in April 2004, 3 years after the Brandts took over. Broad storm, similar in character to the 1977 event. It moved soil across much of Cimarron County. The Brandts' western 120 acres, behind the shelter belt now standing at 38 to 40 feet and producing a protection zone of roughly 400 feet, took minor surface disturbance and no measurable crop loss. The field to the west of them, by then in different ownership than Clarence Voth's era, took significant damage. Jan Brandt called Eldon after the storm, told him what had happened, said the windbreak had held. Eldon said he'd expected it would, said the trees were at full maturity now, said full maturity was where they'd been headed all along, said it had just taken a while. He drove out to see the property once, in the fall of 2007, parked on the county road beside the shelter belt. The cedars were 40 feet tall in the densest sections. The canopy was a wall of dark green running the full 2,600 feet along the western fence and north along the top. He could hear the wind in the upper branches. Couldn't feel it at ground level where he stood. He didn't go in the gate, didn't need to. The trees he'd planted as bare root seedlings in October 1973 were still there, still growing, still doing exactly what the USDA bulletin said they would do, still protecting the ground behind them from whatever the southwest horizon decided to send, still working, just like he'd planned.